2016 was, for most people, nothing more than an ordinary year. However, in the minds of some Brits, it was a most joyous year. For on January 12, 2016, a notorious serial killer died of a heart attack in HM Prison Maghaberry. He was one of the most diabolical criminals in British history, a heinous pedophile. It is highly likely that he molested hundreds of little girls over the course of his sinful life. He was also a brutal serial killer who kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered 4 little girls in England. However, according to data analysis, the actual number of deaths was much higher than 4. It was just that in most cases he could not be charged due to lack of sufficient evidence. Robert Black was born on April 21, 1947, in Grangemouth, Stirlingshire, Scotland, a sprawling industrial behemoth with factory chimneys and the pungent smell of petrochemicals. His birth mother was Jessie Hunter Black. She was 24 years old and unmarried. She worked in the factory, drenched in sweat, but earning a meager income. In the social climate of the time, children born out of wedlock were an unspeakable stigma, and people around them looked at them with scorn and sarcasm. So she didn't tell anyone about it, nor did she reveal his father's name on Robert's birth certificate. In order to escape the stares of those around her, and because raising a child on her own on her meager income would have been too difficult, she abandoned Robert and placed him in foster care. 6 months later, Robert was adopted by Jack and Margaret Tulip. They were a middle-aged couple who had lived through the years, and the old, slightly dilapidated house was furnished with simple furniture, revealing signs of life everywhere. However, during Robert's formative years, his face and limbs were often covered with bruises. They were the marks of beatings and abuse inflicted on him by his adoptive parents during every heated argument. In the locked room, his thin frame huddled in the corner, whimpering, the bruises stark in the low light. In addition to the torment of his foster parents, Robert was also the target of bullying by some of his peers. Because of his short temper, he destroys objects around him when he gets angry. Moreover, he did not care about the cleanliness of his body, even though his foster mom repeatedly admonished him, but still no effect. His classmates called him Smelly Robbie Tulip with disdain, and hardly anyone in the bustling schoolyard wanted to make friends with him. At the age of 5, in a narrow alley, Robert did something extremely disgusting. He cajoled a little girl his age and used flowery language to get her to pull down her pants just to satisfy his curiosity about female genitalia. Since then, Robert has developed an unspeakably intense interest in himself and female genitalia. Whenever night fell in the small, dimly lit room, he would continually stroke his genitals before falling asleep. From the age of 8, as Robert's body matured, he would periodically insert various strange objects into his anus. It could be an ordinary pen, an eraser, or some mind-boggling object. In 1958, with both of his adoptive parents dead, it was as if Robert had unleashed his natural instincts, and he gradually reached out his evil hands to women. At that time, he was placed in a suburban welfare institution. The institution was called Reading House. Here, Robert often exposed himself naked in front of the girls. There was even a time when he and 2 other boys forced a girl of his age to go to a farm field. They forcibly lifted her skirt and removed her underwear and panties, and they wanted to sexually assault her, but due to their incomplete physical development, they couldn't do that, so they just kept touching the girl's body. And one dark night, he dragged a young girl into a public restroom and molested her, but after strong resistance from the girl, she fled and reported Robert's crimes to the welfare agency. As a result of these problems coming to light, he was transferred to Red House in Musselburgh, a much stricter all-male environment, where he was numbered Boy 28. According to the information available, Red House is a residential and caring facility designed to support children in need. However, it was at this place that Robert was tortured. He was sexually abused for 3 years by a male member of staff. He was usually treated like a sex slave, but he did not resist. He just kept obeying orders. During this time, he attended Musselburgh Grammar School, where he developed an interest in soccer and swimming. Although he performed slightly above average academically, he was more interested in sports, particularly soccer, swimming, and athletics. By the summer of 1962, Robert was 15 years old, at which point he was of age to leave Red House. With the help of a welfare agency, he found a job as a delivery boy and rented an apartment in the suburbs. Because of his job, he had full access to the private homes of the customers he was responsible for, which allowed him to easily learn whose children were very young, who were good-looking, and who were always alone, which facilitated his crimes for some time afterward. In the course of his employment, Robert probably molested 30 or 40 girls. There was one girl in the apartment where he was in charge of deliveries, and he would often fondle her body, only sometimes with success, and sometimes without. However, these acts were never officially reported. It wasn't until a year later that Robert was convicted for the first time of what was supposed to be attempted murder for sexually assaulting a young girl. At the time, Robert had coaxed a very cute little girl in a park, and Robert asked her if she wanted to go with him to see kittens. It was obvious that the kitten was very tempting to the little girl, and even when Robert took her to an abandoned building, the little girl followed him very trustingly. Upon entering the abandoned building, Robert reveals his evil nature by grabbing the little girl by the throat, forcing her to the ground, and waiting until the little girl falls into a coma before he removes her panties and then continually strokes the little girl's body with his fingers. When it was over, Robert left the little girl in that abandoned building. He didn't know if she was still alive, but he didn't care. However, by the time the little girl woke up, she was walking down the street naked. She was crying constantly from pain and fear, and her body was bleeding all the time. But the case didn't make waves, and since Robert was a minor, the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Although the court and the police didn't do anything substantial to punish him. But the local residents were so angry that they kept threatening Robert and told him to get out of the neighborhood. Robert then returned to Grangemouth, where he got a job with a builder's supply company and rented an apartment. Robert also met his first real girlfriend. They fell in love, developed a sexual relationship, and decided to get engaged, but they broke up a few months later. Heartbroken, Robert seeks revenge on the community by molesting his landlord and the landlord's 9-year-old granddaughter, but the victims don't call the police, and they just kick him out of the apartment. The news spreads quickly through the town, though, and Robert is fired from his company. Robert then moved to Kinlochleven to live and work. He shared a house with a couple who had a beautiful 7-year-old daughter. The little girl was always home alone because her parents were busy at work. This gave Robert great opportunities. At this time, his desire has been more inflated than when he was a teenager. He is no longer satisfied with simple molestation. After several attempts at molestation, Robert sexually assaulted the little girl. When the sexual assault came to light, Robert was not as lucky as he was in Grangemouth, and the victim's parents called the police. They then took Robert to court, and he was eventually sent to the prison in Polmont for a year of correctional labor. A year later, Robert was released from prison. Tired of Scotland, where he had long been infamous, he moved to London. When he first arrived in London, Robert lived in a cheap room and had to find temporary part-time jobs to earn some meager income. Robert's first official job in London was as a pool attendant, as this job allowed him to see the beautiful bodies of young girls on a regular basis. Sometimes he would go into the corner and look at the girls' bodies and fantasize about making love to them. Sometimes he would touch the girls when they weren't looking. Many of the girls witnessed Robert's lewd behavior, but for various reasons didn't choose to speak up. Until one of the girls who had been molested by Robert could not stand it any longer and told the police about his disgusting behavior. But in the end, because of the lack of sufficient evidence, Robert was not punished by the law, but only fired. When Robert didn't have a job, he didn't do any more bad behavior to any women during that time. Because he found a special site on the internet, it was called Child Pornography Site. There he purchased hundreds of child pornography magazines and more than 50 child pornography videos. On top of that, Robert developed an interest in darts. He spends most of his free time in bars, drinking, playing darts, or working part-time in bars. Although he went to pubs regularly, he never made any good friends because everyone remembered him as someone who liked to annoy people, especially women, and he wouldn't talk about his hobbies or get involved in people's small talk. In 1972, Robert met a Scottish couple, Edward and Kathy Raisin, who thought of him as an avid photographer who liked to go to the beach or to the playground to take videos or pictures of children at play. In 1976, Robert began working as a truck driver for a company called Poster Dispatch and Storage. His job was to deliver posters to various warehouses in England and Scotland. He worked for this company for the next 10 years until his employer fired him because he was often involved in minor car accidents and cost the company a large sum of money in insurance premiums. But shortly after he was fired, this company was purchased by someone else. They rehired Robert because, in the minds of many of the employees, he was a very hard worker, always happy to cover for his coworkers, and liked to choose routes that required him to stay in his car for long periods of time. However, this job set the stage for Robert's subsequent crimes, and over the years he came to know virtually every transportation route in the UK by heart. On August 12, 1981, 9-year-old Jennifer Carty disappeared. Her mother last saw Carty at 1:40 p.m. when she was about to ride her bike to a friend's house, but her friend never saw her coming. However, Carty's bike was found a few hours later, less than a mile from her house, covered in twigs and leaves. The bike's stand had been lowered, suggesting that she had stopped her bike to be talking to someone. A search with the help of 200 volunteers did not reveal anything further. It wasn't until 6 days later that 2 anglers found Carty's body in a nearby reservoir that was a total of 16 miles from her home. Under the medical examiner's examination, Carty's body showed signs of sexual assault, and the cause of death was drowning. It was a hot afternoon on July 30th, 1982, when 11-year-old Susan Maxwell asked her mother if she could ride her bike to a tennis tournament. At first, her mother was reluctant to let Susan ride her bike by herself because she was concerned about traffic safety, but after much deliberation, she told her daughter that she could walk if she wanted to. Because Susan had never traveled very far on her own, but at some point, a child must be allowed to begin the process of becoming independent. Susan's tennis match was about 2 miles from her home, and on that road, Susan knew most of the people she passed on the road. It was an area where people looked out for each other, especially the children. So her mother was not the least bit concerned about her safety. In the end, Susan didn't have to walk to the race because a kind farm worker offered her a ride. It was a very hot afternoon, and after Susan had played tennis for an hour, she became very tired, but she still decided that she would walk home alone. On the way to pick up Susan, her mother thought a lot. Maybe Susan would pamper her, maybe ask her to buy something as a reward, but what she didn't expect was that Susan was missing. She frantically searched for Susan on her way to the tennis court, but never found him. So panicked, she called the police. The police investigation began quickly, and many people saw Susan that afternoon. Some friends or some passersby, in general, a very large number of witnesses. At around 4:30 p.m., there were also witnesses who saw her, but after that, Susan disappeared. In the days that Susan was thought to be missing, the police spent a lot of time and effort investigating clues, and they called on hundreds of volunteers to join in the search, but still nothing was found. That is, until 2 weeks later, when news emerged that scared everyone. A passerby found Susan's body in a ditch next to a highway that was roughly 250 miles from Susan's home. The scene was horrific. Due to the sunlight and being soaked in water, Susan's body had become so disfigured and his entire body was swollen that the coroner could not even identify the cause of Susan's death. The only clue was that Susan's pants had been removed and her underwear was missing. The police's initial suspicion was a rape and murder, although this form was not established. As the disappearance has morphed into a murder, the police continue to investigate, and they keep reporting it on the news. Eventually, a clue surfaced when a psychiatric nurse claimed to have seen a little girl struggling continuously in a maroon-colored car on the day Susan was abducted, but this clue was not taken seriously by the police. A year later, on July 8, 1983, 5-year-old Carolyn Hogg was having a wonderful day in the seaside resort of Portobello on the outskirts of Edinburgh. That afternoon, she had followed her family to a friend's party, and after coming home for dinner, she followed her grandmother and her mother to the bus stop. They returned just before 7 p.m. and spunky Carolyn asked her mother to let her go to the playground a little longer. She often went to the playground because it was only a short walk from their house. Her mother agreed and said she could go and play for 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, since Carolyn never came home, her brother Stuart went to the playground to look for her, but he couldn't find her. Soon the whole family went to the playground but still couldn't find Carolyn, so they called the police. During the police investigation, many witnesses reported seeing a very scruffy man who kept staring at Carolyn. And then, Carolyn was seen holding the man's hand at a playground. And just as they had done last summer, the police quickly set up a search party. More than 600 volunteers walked every inch of the local area for any news of Carolyn, and a week later that number rose to around 2,000. It was the biggest search Scotland had ever seen, but they found nothing. On July 18th, the 10th day after Caroline's disappearance, her body was found beside a highway, about 300 miles from where she had been abducted, and like Susan's, Caroline's body had decomposed from the heat, and the cause of death was a mystery. At this point, the police were in a similar situation to the previous summer. They were diligent, they got tons of information, but they had no real leads and no suspects. On March 26, 1986, 10-year-old Sarah Harper disappeared. She lived in Morley, Leeds. At 8 o'clock that night, just as the drama was ending, Sarah's mother asked one of her children if she would go to the corner store to buy a loaf of bread. Sarah went and, taking £1 from her mother, she went to the K&M store in Peel Street, which was only about 100 yards from her house. At the store, Sarah bought a loaf of bread as well as 2 packets of potato chips. At about 5 minutes past 8, she left the store. In her haste to get home, she took a dark alley. At about 8:15, Sarah's mother became worried about her because the distance from her home to the store should have taken only 5 minutes, but it had been more than 10 minutes, and Sarah still had not returned home. So she sent Sarah's sister Claire out to look for her, and when Claire returned, she had not found Sarah. Immediately afterwards, the family drove out in their car to look for her and called the police. Once again, police investigations were carried out swiftly, but once again they proved fruitless. On April 19th, a passerby was walking his dog along the banks of the River Trent in Nottingham when he noticed something floating in the river. At first he thought it was just a sack, but when he got a good look at what it was, he called the police. The police quickly recovered the body, and according to forensics, it was the body of a little girl who had suffered a very horrific ordeal during her lifetime, with her genitals and anus torn open. Finally, the body was also identified as Sarah, who had disappeared 10 days earlier. With the bodies of all 3 victims found far from their homes and less than 20 miles between each body, the police felt that the killer in this case was most likely a truck driver. After canvassing the area, the police added Robert to their list of suspects. On July 14, 1990, in a quiet hamlet in the Scottish borders, Robert was arrested by the police. At the time, a retired postmaster was busy building in his garden. He saw a blue van slowing to a halt across the road. At first, as his neighbor's sweet, innocent little girl of 6 years of age bounced by, he saw the driver of the van step out of the vehicle and carefully clean the windshield. However, as he bent down and carefully organized the grass clippings on the ground, he suddenly saw the girl's little feet lifted up. When he straightened up, he realized with horror that the van driver was pushing the little girl hard toward the car. The postmaster instantly realized that this was a horrific case of kidnapping, and he rushed to inform his neighbors while quickly calling the police. Just a few minutes later, 6 police cars arrived at the scene. After getting the details of the situation, the police officers immediately sped off in the direction in which the van had left. After half an hour of intense tracking, the police managed to capture the driver of the van, who was Robert, when the poor little girl was tied tightly in a sleeping bag in the trunk. Her slim wrists were tied behind her back. Her small legs were also firmly tied together. Her mouth was tightly gagged, and she was wearing a suffocating hood on her head. Fortunately, the little girl was eventually rescued. As the police officers carefully searched the van, they felt that this was not an ordinary kidnapping case, for they found some extremely strange things inside the van. Bundles of strong rope, a Polaroid camera, many different styles of girls' clothes, and an array of chilling sex toys. The police then began a full and careful search for information about Robert. After a series of painstaking investigations, they had reason to presume that Robert was most likely the real murderer of the previous brutal murders. And so, in the spring of 1994, Robert went on trial. He was charged with a series of heinous crimes: the rape and murder of 3 girls, the kidnapping of a 6-year-old girl, and the kidnapping of a 15-year-old girl in 1988. On May 19th, a jury, after careful deliberation, found Robert guilty and sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before he could be eligible for parole. The murder of Jennifer Carty took a long time to come to light until 2011. In addition, police highly suspect that Robert was closely linked to at least 14 murders and disappearances of children in the UK and continental Europe during the long period from 1969 to 1989. On April 8, 1969, 13-year-old April Fabb rode her bicycle with the full intention of traveling to her sister's home. However, she ended up strangely missing. Her bike was found in a silent field, but her body was never seen. On August 19, 1978, 13-year-old Jeanette Tate was brutally kidnapped while on her way to deliver a newspaper. Her bicycle lay alone in a country driveway, and her own body was likewise never found. On July 28, 1979, 14-year-old Suzanne Lawrence disappeared without a trace after leaving her sister's home, and her body was never found. On March 18, 1977, 6-year-old Mary Boyle was last seen near her grandmother's home in Casherard, near Ballyshannon, County Doll, before she too was lost, and again her body was never found. Ultimately, Robert died on January 12, 2016, alone in prison. None of his family members were present at his funeral, and his ashes were mercilessly scattered into the ocean. The identity of his real father was never revealed, and his real mother married a man and settled in Australia after giving birth to him. Robert had several siblings, but they had no idea who Robert really was. Robert was born out of wedlock, and his biological mother abandoned him to foster care due to social pressure. This left him with a lack of stable family care and identity from the beginning and an inner turmoil. In the foster family, beatings and abuse by his foster parents kept him in constant fear and pain. This violent environment has made him distrustful of others and may have also stimulated his inner feelings of anger and defiance. Meanwhile, being bullied by his peers further deepened his sense of loneliness and low self-esteem, making it difficult for him to integrate into society normally. The undesirable behaviors at the age of 5 were not properly guided and corrected, but instead gave him a wrong perception of and curiosity about sex. Thereafter, his abnormal attention to himself and female genitalia, as well as his self-abusive behavior during adolescence, showed the abnormal development of his sexual psychology. An extremely critical turning point was the 3 years of sexual abuse by male staff at a welfare institution, where Robert was transformed from a victim to a potential victimizer who did not resist but only obeyed orders, which led him to believe that violence and sexual assault were an acceptable pattern of behavior. This experience further reinforced his sexual deviance and made him more likely to inflict the pain he suffered on others as an adult. After breaking up with his girlfriend, Robert chooses to take revenge on society. This shows that he lacks proper emotion management and the ability to cope with frustration, and instead vents his dissatisfaction and pain by hurting others. At this point, his criminal behavior gradually escalates from mere molestation to sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder. However, so many innocent people were victimized because of the mistakes made by other people. The families of all the victims suffered great pain and trauma. Parents who have lost a child not only have to suffer the loss of their child, but also have to deal with the pressure and questions of society. Their lives may be changed forever, and it is difficult to return to normal. Siblings of the victim may also be traumatized, affecting their growth and development. Remember, if you have a beautiful and happy life, please don't get into an argument with some awful people.